On the morning that murder first brushed past the village of Little Belton, the sun shone with a particular determination, as though intent on proving that nothing truly dreadful could possibly happen. And so pretty boys. Roses, heavy with late summer bloom, drooped over cottage walls. Bees fussed in lavender borders, and in the rectory garden a long trestle table sagged slightly in the middle. Under the weight of cakes, trifles, and plates of carefully curled sandwiches, it was the rector's garden party, and in Little Belton such an occasion was only a shade less important than Christmas. People had taken care with their appearance. Hats were produced that had not seen the light since the coronation. Gloves were unearthed, and even the village boys, conscripted as errand runners, had been scrubbed into temporary respectability. Miss Jane Marple, a small elderly lady in a dove-grey coat and a sensible straw hat, sat a little to one side beneath an old damson tree. She was companionably alone, with a plate of sea cake on her lap, and the air of someone who found people infinitely more interesting than food. Her blue eyes, apparently vague, moved with quiet attention from group to group. Near the tea table, Mrs. Emmeline Carter, wife of the local doctor, arranged a plate of Clare with the same brisk competence she applied to her husband's appointments. She was talking rather too loudly, in the opinion of some, to Inspector Harold Graves, who had come in his capacity as a guest. Though one suspected he seldom forgot his badge, even in Borough Mufti. "I always say," Mrs. Carter declared, "that Little Belton is the safest village in England. We've never had a proper crime here. Not like those dreadful things you read in the papers." Inspector Graves smiled with toleration. "We've had our share of petty thefts, Mrs. Carter. That business with Mr. Keir, Ellison's hens." "Oh, hens," said Mrs. Carter, dismissing the poultry with a flick of her hand. "I mean real crime. Murders and such. Not that I should like one, of course." Miss Marple said Marple's needle. "Yes, dear, clearly. She was knitting something pastel and mysterious which might, in the fullness of time, become a baby's shawl or a bedspread, for one never knew how such things would turn out. At Mrs. Carter's words, her fingers paused for the smallest fraction of a moment, then resumed their rhythm. Across the lawn, a slight commotion developed near the marquee. The rector's wife, fluttering and pink, was making anxious gestures toward the clock on the church tower, plainly visible over the yew hedge. "But he promised faithfully," she fretted to a sympathetic circle. "He would arrive by 3 o'clock at the latest. It is most inconvenient." He was Mr. Leonard Arkwright, the newly arrived owner of Belton House, the great stone manor that had lain shuttered and empty for nearly a decade. His purchase of the place had provoked vigorous discussion in the village, for newcomers of any sort were of interest, and rich newcomers infinitely more so. Some called Mr. Bahadsa Arkwright a retired businessman. Others said mysteriously that shipping was involved. There were darker whispers too, about money lost in London, about enemies, and about a lady or several ladies who had not been treated as ever wished. Miss Marple had heard all this, and more, at her boarding house in St. Mary Mead, where she was spending a few months between visits to various relatives. She had accepted the rector's cousinly invitation to Little Belton with pleasure, partly because she enjoyed a change of garden scenery, and partly because she had found long life that where money, pride, and a new large house were involved, human nature tended to arrange itself in highly instructive patterns. "Ah, there," said Inspector Graves suddenly. A low hum ran through the assembly. A motor car, dark and shining, had drawn up at the gate. The driver, a neat man in livery, stepped smartly out and opened the rear door. After a moment, a tall figure emerged, paused and looked over the garden, with a serving air that was not quite arrogance, but came close to it. Leonard Arkwright was handsome in an angular, polished way. His hair touched at the temples with premature grey. Beside him, a younger woman alighted, slim, fashionably dressed, with a hat that looked far too sophisticated for Little Belton, and eyes that took everything in at once. "So he did bring her," murmured Mrs. Carter, who had appeared beside Miss Marple with the mysterious ability of energetic women to be in several places almost at once. "His ward, he calls her. Ward indeed. Mark my words, there's more to that than meets the eye." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Very often is, dear," she agreed. though what meets the eye is sometimes quite enough if one knows how to look. At that precise moment, the church clock began to strike 3. Its deep, measured notes rolled over the garden, solemn and unhurried. No one could have guessed that before its hands had completed another hour's journey, Leonard Arkwright would be lying motionless on the close-cropped rectory lawn, his eyes stares up at the benevolent summer sky, and that someone in that very gathering would have tried for the 3rd time to murder him. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The tableau on the lawn, sprawling body, crushed dahlias, the overturned glass glinting in the grass, seemed almost theatrical. A tableau vivant arranged for some grotesque pageant. Then reality resumed with a vengeance. Sylvia Fortescue's shriek cut through the stunned silence, high and piercing. She dropped to her knees beside her husband, heedless of the soil staining her pale muslin dress. "Reggie! Reggie, get up! This isn't funny! Reggie! Dr. Good." Haydock was already pushing his way through the tightening ring of onlookers, his usually genial expression set in grim concentration. "Stand back, please. Give him air." "Mrs. Price Ridley, if you would be so kind as to stop screaming in my ear. Yes, thank you." Miss Marple remained seated beneath the oak, her knitting forgotten in her lap, though her eyes missed little. She watched the way Sylvia's hands fluttered helplessly over her husband's shoulders, never attempting anything so practical, as practical as loosening his collar. She noted the vicar clumsily trying to usher children away, while Mrs. Bantry hovered with a peculiar mixture of alarm and fascination. Is it?" fluttered Dolly Bantry, turning half toward Miss Marple, as though by instinct. "I should imagine so," Miss Marple murmured, not unkindly, as Dr. Owl. Haydock checked the Colonel's pulse, his mouth tightening. After a moment, the doctor exhaled slowly and looked up at the expectant faces around him. "I'm afraid Colonel Fortescue is dead." The words fell like stones into a still pond. A collective gasp rippled outward. Then, inevitably, came the murmurs. "Dead? Just like that?" Mrs. Price Ridley exclaimed, one gloved hand pressed theatrically to her bosom. "Why, he was talking only a moment ago, perfectly hale and hearty. People often are," said Miss Marple, almost to herself. "Until they are not." "Someone fetch Constable Reeves, Dr. Haydock ordered briskly, rising and brushing soil from his knees. "No one is to touch that glass, do you hear? Not a soul." His gaze, moving sharply over the cluster of villagers, caught Miss Marple's for an instant. A flicker of understanding seemed to pass between them. She inclined her head, the very picture of mild agreement. As the initial shock gave way to practical flurry, St. Mary Mead reverted to type with remarkable speed. "Mrs. Bantry began directing servants to guide guests into the shade and produce smelling salts for those who felt faint, whether genuinely or by social obligation. The vicar muttered something about God's mysterious ways, visibly torn between pastoral duty and a rather unseemly curiosity. Gossip, like an efficient, well-trained creature, was already at work. "You heard him yourself," hissed Mrs. Price Ridley to her companion, Mrs. Hartnell, just loud enough for half the lawn to enjoy. "He said someone was trying to kill him, break cables, church gargoyles. Oh, it's positively lurid." "But that was just his usual bluster, surely," protested Mrs. Hartnell, whose conscience did battle with her appetite for scandal. "Men do like to make a drama of their ailment. Break cables are not an ailment," Mrs. Price Ridley returned triumphantly. "And now dead, on the spot, with everyone watching. If that isn't murder, I shall eat my hat." Miss Marple's attention, however, was less on the gossips than on Sylvia Fortescue, who had been assisted to a garden chair beneath a nearby tree. Someone had placed a glass of water in her trembling hand. Her face was oddly drained, as if the colour had been washed out from within rather than merely shocked away. "My poor husband," Sylvia said faintly, but Miss Marple could not help noticing that no tears had yet emerged. Shock did strange things, of course. Some women shrieked and wept, others went quite numb. Still, the old lady had lived long enough to distinguish between genuine desolation and what she privately called social grief. Constable Reeves arrived at last, slightly out of breath and with an expression that clearly indicated this was more excitement than he had anticipated for a village fete. He removed his helmet, scratched his head, and surveyed the scene with the solemnity he imagined befit the occasion. "Now then," he began, in the manner of a man who had rehearsed such words, "what's all this?" "It appears to be exactly what it looks like, Constable, Doctor," Haydock replied crisply. "A sudden death, under highly suspicious circumstances." And this after he'd been going on about people trying to kill him. Mrs. Bantry could not resist adding, "You all heard him, Reeves. Everyone did." Constable Reeves shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, well, best not to jump to conclusions. Could be his heart, you know. The Colonel was no spring chicken." "He wasn't purple before he took that drink," de Haydock said dryly. "And I've never yet seen a man's heart stop quite so theatrically of its own accord." Reeves followed the doctor's pointed glance to the abandoned punch glass. Its contents a sticky puddle in the grass. His expression hardened with the dawning sense that this might indeed be something beyond a routine report. "We'll have to keep everyone here," he announced, trying for authority, "till I've spoken to you all. No one leaves Greenways." Under the oak, Miss Marple resumed her knitting with apparent calm, though the rhythm of her needles had altered almost imperceptibly. No one, she reflected, ever truly left a scene like this, not in the ways that mattered. They carried it with them, in their words, in their silences, in the tiny betrayals of eye and gesture. And those she knew were where the truth usually lived. Inspector Slack's gaze fixed on Sylvia Fortescue with all the subtlety of a searchlight. "You gave him the drink, ma'am," he said, in a tone that made it less a question than an accusation. Sylvia seemed to rouse herself at last from her stunned immobility. She looked at the inspector as though seeing him from some great distance. "Yes," she said slowly. I brought him the punch, but I didn't—" Her voice broke on the last word, and she pressed her lips together, mastering herself with visible effort. "I didn't poison my husband." "We'll see about that," muttered Inspector Slack, producing a small notebook. "No one leave the grounds without my say-so. This is a murder inquiry now. Make no mistake." He gestured toward the table. "Sergeant, see that glass is secured. We'll need it sent off for analysis." Miss Marple, who'd always found that the most useful analyses occurred in the privacy of one's own mind, watched as a uniformed constable carefully wrapped the glass in a handkerchief. The faint, bitter almond scent hung in the air for a moment longer before the breeze dispersed it. "Mrs. Fortescue," the inspector continued, "where did you get the punch from?" "Oh, from the bowl, of course," Sylvia replied, her composure returning by degrees. "It was on the main table with the other drinks." "Anyone else have some of that punch?" Slack demanded, turning abruptly to the onlookers. A murmur rose, several hands lifted hesitantly. Mrs. Bantry spoke up. "I had half a glass not 10 minutes ago, Inspector. Perfectly delicious, and I assure you I'm quite alive." Slack grunted. "Then it's not the punch as a whole. More likely the poison was added to that particular glass." His eyes narrowed. "You poured it yourself, did you?" "No," Sylvia said, and now a faint note of irritation threaded her grief. "The maid, Alice, was serving earlier. She filled the glass for me when I asked. I simply carried it to my husband." "Alice Cartwright, that would be," Miss Marple murmured under her breath, recalling a shy, freckled girl with a tendency to giggle and a fondness for hair ribbons. She had been hovering nervously near the table earlier, hoping, no doubt, not to spill anything on the Colonel's good tablecloths. Inspector Slack seized upon the new name with relish. "Where is this Alice, then?" A small figure detached herself from the cluster of servants at the edge of the lawn. Alice's eyes were wide with terror, her apron crumpled in clenched fingers. "Please, she stammered. "I only did what I was told, Mrs. Fortescue asked for a glass for the Colonel, and I ladled it out and handed it to her. I never put nothing in it, sir. I swear on my mother's grave." "Your mother's alive, you silly girl," Mrs. Bantry's cook called unhelpfully from the back, earning herself a sharp look from her mistress. "Be quiet, all of you," Slack snapped. He studied the girl a moment longer, then apparently decided she was too frightened to be anything but truthful for the present. "We'll take proper statements later." The body had been respectfully covered now with a tablecloth borrowed from the tea tent, though Miss Marple noted with some regret that it was one of Mrs. Bantry's best linen ones. People drifted into smaller groups, each cluster forming its own little universe of speculation and certainty. "It'll be the wife, you see," murmured Mr. Bowden, the village butcher, to any men who would listen. "Always is in these cases. Young wife, old husband, plenty of money at stake. Mark my words, that's how it'll shake out." "Not necessarily," Miss Weatherby countered primly. "The Colonel's nephew stands to inherit, does he not? And from what I've observed, Mr. Lionel Fortescue is not a young man troubled by an excess of scruple." Miss Marple's eyes rested briefly on Lionel, who was now in close conversation with Timothy Grant, the young architect whose courtship of Elesnor Ward had so enraged the Colonel. Their heads were bent together, their expressions tense, A curious alliance, she thought, between a presumptive heir and a man the deceased had threatened in public. Inspector Slack, who had been scribbling in his notebook, turned abruptly toward the oak tree where Miss Marple had once more ensconced herself. His expression altered slightly upon seeing her, as though he had discovered a small but unavoidable pebble in his shoe. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, with an attempt at civility that fooled no one. "You were sitting there the whole time, I take it. See anything unusual?" Miss Marple regarded him over her spectacles with an expression of mild surprise, as though the very idea of her witnessing anything extraordinary were faintly absurd. "Oh, my dear Inspector, I'm afraid I saw only what everyone else saw. Colonel Fortescue complaining very loudly, as is, or rather was, his habit, Mrs. Fortescue bringing him a drink, and then, well, the poor man's unfortunate seizure." "But you do notice things," Slack persisted, his pen poised. "Little things. You've a reputation for it, if you don't mind my saying." "People are very kind," Miss Marple said gently. "Though I have always thought that most things are perfectly obvious if one pays attention. Human nature does not change, you know, it merely alters its costume." Slack snort. "Well, if you do think of anything that might actually help, you let me know. For now, we've a clear line. Drink handed to him by the wife, poison in the glass, plenty of motive, if half what I've heard about their marriage is true." Miss Marple nodded, as though entirely in agreement, though inwardly she was not so sure. Clear lines, she had long ago discovered, were often drawn by people determined not to see what lay in the periphery, and 3 attempts at murder, one mechanical, one architectural, and one chemical, rarely pointed to a straightforward domestic quarrel. She watched as Sylvia Fortescue, now seated and surrounded by solicitous ladies, accepted a cup of tea with automatic politeness. Her hand, Miss Marple observed, shook only when she believed no one was looking. The fete dissolved not with the orderly conclusion of raffles and prize-givings, but with the disjointed scattering of groups who moved in hushed clusters toward the lane, casting Whodunit's back at the cordoned-off patch of lawn where Colonel Fortescue's body still lay beneath a hastily procured tarpaulin. Greenway's Manor, so lately a scene of laughter and trivial concerns, had acquired a chill about it, as if the house itself resented becoming a place where something so final had happened. By early evening, St. Mary Mead was humming like a disturbed hive. Curtains twitched conspicuously, and kettle after kettle was set upon the stove with determined purpose. In the High Street, Miss Hartnell held forth in the grocer's with the air of one personally affronted by murder occurring in her vicinity. It was that wife of his, mark my words, she declared conclusively, accepting her parcel of tea. Far too calm and far too well dressed. Women like that do not break down in public, because they have something to hide. Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. Calm? She looked practically carved from marble. Besides, one hears things. I have it on the best authority that Colonel Fortescue made her life quite unbearable. A woman can only take so much. Such authority proved somewhat inevitably to be Mr. Hawes at the post office, who had overheard a heated exchange about household expenditure 2 days prior, and had since inflated it into a drama of almost operatic proportions. By supper time, half the village was convinced Sylvia Fortescue had poisoned her husband, while the other half had decided it was clearly Lionel, the wastrel nephew desperate for his inheritance. In her neat little cottage on the lane, Miss Marple took a more measured view. She sat in her usual armchair, a small tray arranged with exacting care beside her, teapot, cup, a single slice of seed cake, while the evening sun slanted gently through the lace. Curtains. Her knitting lay untouched for once, abandoned on the arm of the chair. Across from her, Mrs. Bantry perched on the edge of the opposite seat, her plump hands folded tightly. I shall never forgive myself, Jane. Poison in my punch. It sounds like one of those lurid magazine stories. I feel as though I've been made an accomplice to murder. My dear Dolly, Miss Marple said soothingly, no one in their senses would hold you responsible. The punch was merely a conveyance. Poison has to travel somehow. Teacup, glass, sugar bowl. I recall a curious business with a chocolate box in Exeter years ago. Very tragic, though the chocolates were quite good, I understand. I wish you wouldn't talk about chocolates and poison in the same breath, Mrs. Bantry shuddered. But really, Jane, what do you think? Was it Sylvia or that dreadful Lionel? He looked positively eager when Inspector Slack started talking about the will. Miss Marple folded her hands, her expression mild. It is always tempting to seize upon the most obvious person, particularly when they are also the most unsympathetic. Husbands and wives quarrel. Nephews are often mercenary, but if one has learned anything from village life, It is that people's motives are rarely as simple as they appear." She considered for a moment. The Colonel believed someone had already tried to kill him twice. That much he said, very loudly indeed. It seems unlikely that he would invent such a thing out of whole cloth, though men of his temperament do enjoy a sense of drama. "And now he's really dead, Mrs." Bantry murmured. 3 attempts. It's rather like the old fairy tales. The 3rd time is always the charm, isn't it? Or, Miss Marple said softly, the 3rd time is the one that is meant to be noticed. Mrs. Bantry blinked. Meant to be noticed? Well, my dear, consider. A brake failure. Most regrettable, but not unheard of. A falling gargoyle, again tragic, but such things do happen with old buildings. Both events could be passed off as accidents. Yet today, at a public gathering, with half the village present, we have a very deliberate and visible method. Poison in éclateur in full view of everyone. You mean someone wanted it known that the Colonel had been murdered? Possibly. Or someone felt that the previous efforts had not been taken seriously enough. Miss Marple's eyes had that absent inward look that Dolly Bantry had learned to associate with highly active mental processes. People can be so very impatient. Outside, footsteps sounded on the path. A moment later, there was a firm knock. Mrs. Bantry started. "That will be Inspector Slack, I suppose." "Oh dear." He always looks at me as though I'm hiding corpses in the shrubbery. Inspector Slack did indeed stand on the threshold when Miss Marple opened the door, his hat in his hand and a set expression on his face. "Evening, Miss Marple. Mrs. Bantry." "I am." He nodded briefly. "Thought I'd better have a word." "You were both close to the deceased this afternoon." Miss Marple stepped back to admit him, her manner the very picture of elderly politeness. "Of course, Inspector. Do sit down. I expect you've had a very tiring day." Slack perched warily on the edge of a chair as if afraid comfort might blunt his professional edge. "We've confirmed it was cyanide, just as Haydock said. Glass has gone off to the lab, but I don't put much stock in that. The main thing is, we've narrowed the time. Only a small window for anyone to tamper with that drink." "And have you," Miss Marple inquired sweetly, "narrowed the people as well as the time?" His eyes flicked to suspicious of mockery and finding only placid interest. "Working on it. But I can tell you this much. Whoever killed Colonel Fortescue knew exactly what they were doing." Miss Marple's fingers brushed the edge of her abandoned knitting. "Oh, yes," she agreed softly. "I imagine they did." The sun had begun its slow descent by the time Inspector Slack finished his initial round of questioning. The fate, once so full of colour and animation, had taken on an oddly suspended air. The bunting still fluttered. The gramophone still sat on its table, but no one suggested music now. People spoke in hushed undertones, as though sound itself might disturb the uneasy presence of death among the dahlias. Colonel Fortescue's body had been removed at last, conveyed to Dr. Haydock's surgery to await formal examination. The crushed flowers remained, a vulgar wound in the immaculate borders. Miss Marple found her gaze returning to that scarred patch of garden with the same persistence one gives to a half-remembered face. Something about it nagged at her, though she could not yet say precisely what. Inspector Slack, having dispatched Constable Polk to take further statements at Greenways later that evening, approached Miss Marple with an air of resigned obligation. "I suppose," he said, standing with his hands thrust into his pockets, "you have some theory already, Miss Marple?" "Oh dear no," Miss Marple replied, with mild surprise. "One wouldn't presume to form a theory on such limited evidence. At this stage, it is merely a matter of noticing things. For instance, I wonder if you observed that the Colonel hesitated slightly before drinking." Slack frowned. "Hesitated? He'd have toasted to survival and tossed it back in one go." "Precisely." Miss Marple said. But just before that, there was a tiny pause. It reminded me very much of old Mr. Treadgold, who always smelt his claret first because his housekeeper once mixed up the bottles. People who have recently had attempts made on their lives are apt to be cautious. "You think he suspected something wrong with the drink?" "I think he considered the possibility and dismissed it," Mr. Marple answered. Which might suggest that the notion of his wife poisoning him did not seem credible to him. He took the glass from her hand quite calmly, after all. Slack made a non-committal noise. "Husbands don't always know their wives as well as they imagine." "Very true," Miss Marple agreed placidly. "Nor wives their husbands, for that matter. Still one cannot help noticing. And then there is the matter of the spoon. Spoon? Slack repeated blankly. The ladle, rather, Miss Marple amended. I observed that Miss Fortescue did not use it. She picked up a clean glass from the tray, turned her back for a moment, obscuring our view of the table, and then returned with the filled glass. Now, if one were simply serving from the punch bowl, there would be no reason to turn one's back. It is a small thing, of course, but small things are often the most revealing. Slack's eyes sharpened despite himself. You mean someone else could have handed her the glass already dosed? Or she could have poured from somewhere other than the bowl? One merely notes possibilities, Miss Marple said. There was quite a clutter there. Bottles, jugs. Mrs. Bantry's second bowl of non-alcoholic lemonade. Various glasses. In confusion, one glass looks much like another. Before Slack could respond, Haydock approached, wiping his spectacles with a handkerchief. I can confirm cyanide at least by smell, he said grimly. We'll know more after the post-mortem, but I shouldn't expect surprises. Fast acting, as you saw. Someone wanted a public death. Public, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. Yes, that is important, I think. The first two attempts were quite different. Private, one might say. An accident with the brakes, a piece of falling stone at a quiet moment. But this was arranged in full view of the entire village. Haydock nodded. A bold move. Or a desperate one, Miss Marple murmured. Her expression was almost wistful. It reminds me so much of that business with that poor Miss Poulter's canary, the one who kept escaping its cage until finally it was found dead on the windowsill. One might think the cat responsible, but it turned out to be rather more complicated. I don't particularly want to hear about canaries, Slack said shortly. I want to know who had cyanide and the opportunity to use it. Gardeners, perhaps, Miss Marple suggested mildly. It is used for certain pests, I believe. And there are always little bottles among photographers' those things. Dangerous substances do get about, but I dare say Greenways itself will prove more illuminating than conjecture, Slack grunted. I'm going up there now to speak to the servants and look over the place. You'll forgive me if I don't invite you along, Miss Marple. Oh, quite, she said pleasantly, but I must see to my kettle and my roses. Still, one can't help feeling that Greenways will not be quite the same house after today. House, no, and I remember things. They show in odd little ways. As the inspector strode off, Miss Marple allowed herself one last survey of the flattened dahlias, the stained tablecloth, the abandoned punch bowl catching the last of the light. Something, she felt, had been out of place, not dramatically so, though just a quiet wrongness, like a single weed in an otherwise well-tended border. It would come to her, she felt sure, once she had a nice cup of tea to think it over. By the time Miss Marple returned to her neat little house on the high street, the news of Colonel Fortescue's dramatic demise had already beaten her there by a comfortable margin. The curtains at half the cottages along the lane quivered with barely concealed curiosity, and the air was thick with the invisible hum of speculation that always followed any disturbance to village routine. She had scarcely removed her hat and folded her lace gloves when there came a determined rap at the door. Without needing to look, she knew that particular brand of peremptory knock. It was, of course, Mrs. Bantry. My dear Jane, I simply absolutely had to come at once, Mrs. Bantry announced as she swept into the sitting room without waiting to be invited. Her floral hat slightly askew from the haste of her journey. I told Arthur I should go quite mad if I had to sit with his solemn face for another minute. The man is already composing a sermon about the fleeting nature of life, and we haven't even buried the poor colonel yet. Miss Marple, arranging a tray with habitual precision, merely nodded. It was very upsetting, she agreed mildly, though the colonel himself did rather invite drama with those public pronouncements about attempted murder. People who shout too are often, I find, not taken seriously enough, until it is too late. Mrs. Mudir. Bantry sank into the chintz-covered armchair, eyes alight with morbid curiosity. Well, you saw it all, Jane. What do you think? Sylvia, of course, is what everyone is saying. Handed him the poisoned to drink herself. Very damning, I'm afraid. And that business of being much younger, a second wife and so on. Village history is not kind to such women. Miss Marple poured out the tea with steady hands. Appearances, Dolly, are useful things, but they can be arranged, rather like the flowers at the fete, placed just so to draw the eye where one wishes it to go. I noticed Sylvia was very pale, but then many women turn pale at a sudden death. Shocked us that. Yet she did not scream. No, Mrs. Bantry agreed eagerly. She just stood there, quite frozen. Rather unnatural, I thought. Not necessarily, Miss Marple murmured. Some people shout, some faint, some become almost rigid. I once knew a housemaid who reacted in precisely that way when she accidentally set fire to the curtains. Her inability to move did not mean she had wanted the fire. She added, almost absently, I'm more interested in those who are not looking at Sylvia at all. Did Pemberkent? Bantry blinked. Not looking at her? Yes. At the moment of the Colonel's collapse, several people turned immediately toward him. That is natural, but one or two looked first at other people. Anticipation, can be most revealing. One expects a certain reaction, and one wishes to see whether it occurs. Mrs. Bantry frowned, trying to recall. Well, I was behind the table with the tarts. What a mess, Jane. Strawberry everywhere. But I seem to remember Lionel glancing toward Eleanor first, as if to see what she would do. Just so, Miss Marple said, as though this merely confirmed some minor point. And Eleanor, I think, looked toward Timothy Grant before she looked at the Colonel. Fear for those we love is often stronger than horror at any general catastrophe. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. Do you think one of them did it then? Lionel, perhaps. He stands to gain, and everyone knows he's been living rather fast. Or Timothy, Colonel, standing in the way of romance and all that. It would be almost romantic in a horrid way. I think Mrs. Marple replied carefully that several people were extremely relieved by the Colonel's death, but relief, Dolly, is not the same as guilt. No, what troubles me is the progression. Progression? The 3 attempts, Miss Marple said. Rakes tampered with, masonry loosened, and now poisoned in solution. 3 very different methods, requiring 3 different sorts of knowledge, each increasingly bold, but also, oddly, increasingly clumsy. That spill on the table, for instance. A nervous hand at the final moment, perhaps. Outside, the sound of footsteps on gravel preceded the appearance of Inspector Slack's solid figure. At the big good. He paused, eyeing Miss Marple's cottage with a mixture of reluctance and grim necessity. After a moment's visible struggle with his pride, he opened the gate and strode up the path. I thought he'd come, Miss Marple observed placidly. The police are very sensible on the whole. They prefer simple solutions, of course, but when things begin to look untidy, they occasionally remember that old ladies see more than they ought. And Bantry sat up straighter, eyes shining. Do you think he's stuck already, Jane? Not stuck, perhaps, Miss Marple said, smoothing her skirt. Merely beginning to realise that what appears straightforward may, in fact, be quite the opposite. Rather like a knitting pattern, Dolly. So simple on paper, until one discovers the row of tiny, easily missed instructions halfway through. At that precise moment, the firm knock sounded again upon her front door. Miss Marple rose, her expression properly surprised and welcoming, though inwardly she already sensed that the real investigation was about to begin in earnest. Inspector Slack's fortune showed no such imaginative flexibility. By mid-afternoon, Mary Mead hummed with the confident assertion that Lionel Fortescue was as good as arrested. The discovery of the cyanide bottle in the potting shed, coupled with his proximity to the refreshment table, formed, so most villagers agreed, a case so tidy that only the wilfully perverse could question it. Miss Marple, seated by her cottage window with her knitting and a particularly unobtrusive view of the lane, was privately quite perverse on the subject. She watched Lionel stride past with a truculent set to his shoulders, heading in the direction of the manor. His gait betrayed agitation rather than resignation. A man anticipating confrontation, not imprisonment. A few minutes later, Timothy Grant followed, walking quickly, glancing back more than once as though afraid of being observed. Eleanor came last, slower, her face troubled, pausing at the gate to Greenways as if considering whether to go in at all. Miss Marple laid aside her knitting. The convergence of those 3 young people at the recently bereaved household did not, to her mind, argue peace and harmony. She reached for her hat and light coat with the matter-of-factness of one who merely intended to pay a consoling call on a widow of her acquaintance. Greenways Manor, when she arrived, had an atmosphere quite distinct from those previous days' turmoil. The house seemed to be holding its breath. A maid admitted her with subdued reluctance, and when asked for Mrs. Fortescue, hesitated. Madam is in the morning room, with Mr. Lionel and Miss Vance and Mr. Grant. The girl lowered her voice, though no one was nearby. There's been quite a quarrel, if you don't mind my saying so. Miss Marple did not mind in the least. Quarrels are most understandable at such time. Greek takes many forms. The muffled sound of raised voices greeted her even before the maid opened the door to the morning room. It was Lionel's tone that dominated. Brittle, angry drawl stripped it of its usual lazy amusement. "And I tell you, it's a plant," he was saying as Miss Marple entered quietly. "Anyone with half an ounce of sense can see that. My handkerchief in the potting shed. I haven't been in that wretched place for months." "Perhaps," Sylvia Fortescue replied in a level too careful tone, "you left the handkerchief there some time ago. You're inclined to be careless." Eleanor, standing near the window, turned quickly at Miss Marple's entrance, a flash of relief crossing her strained face. Timothy looked distinctly uncomfortable, as though regretting his decision to attend this conference. "I do hope I'm not intruding," Miss Marple said, her voice all gentle apology. "I came to see how you were bearing up, Mrs. Fortescue. Such a terrible shock, and one so public. People often underestimate how very fatiguing that can be." The tension in the room shifted slightly, embarrassment overlaying hostility. Sylvia pressed her fingers to her temples. "Miss Marple, forgive us. You are very kind. It's only Lionel insists that Inspector Slack is entirely wrong and—" "Inspector Slack is an ass," Lionel interrupted rudely. "No offence to your fondness for the constabulary, Miss Marple, but he sees what he wishes to see and nothing more. I did not poison Uncle Reggie. Someone is extremely eager that I should hang for it, however." "That thought had occurred to me also," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Deliberately incriminating evidence is rarely as subtle as its planter imagines. People have such faith in monograms. So very convenient, but they do get lost, you know. I recall poor Mr. Ellison in our choir once put his handkerchief into the wrong cassock and nearly lost his good name because of it." Timothy shifted uneasily. "If Lionel didn't do it, then who did? The police are convinced. Slack practically told me this morning they'd have him in the custody by tonight." "Mr. Radford, perhaps," Eleanor said, her voice tight. "You saw how he looked, Lionel, yesterday at the fete, and he had reason enough after what Reggie did to his development." "Radford's a bully and a bore," Lionel acknowledged, "but I don't credit him with that degree of finesse. Break cables, gargoyles, poisoned medicine, and then a public performance with cyanide in the punch. It's like something out of a lurid serial. Far too elaborate for Radford's bludgeoning intellect." Miss Marple's eyes, apparently vague, drifted from face to face. Sylvia, pale, composed, yet with the faint shadows of sleeplessness. Lionel, defiant, but genuinely frightened under the bravado. Eleanor, rigid, eyes burning with a mixture of guilt and anger. Timothy, ill at ease, glancing often toward Eleanor, as if to take his cue from her. It was Eleanor who, after a small silence, spoke with startling abruptness. "What if it wasn't one person?" she demanded. "What if everyone is so very certain about Lionel because they've been thinking like Inspector Slack? One villain, one plan, one dramatic solution. But what if Uncle Reggie had more than one would-be murderer?" The words dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Timothy stared at her. Sylvia's hand tightened around her handkerchief. Lionel gave a short, mirthless laugh. "Multiple murderers," he said. "Good Lord, how very modern." Miss Marple did not laugh. Her mind had already travelled that path. "There is a curious saying, my dear," she remarked gently, "about too many cooks spoiling the broth. One might wonder what happens when too many hands attempt to season the same fatal cup." Before Eleanor could respond, the door opened abruptly, and the Constable Polk appeared, breathless and flustered. "Begging your pardon, madam, but Inspector Slack sends word Mr. Radford has been found in his yard, unconscious. Looks very much like another attempt at murder." By the time Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock, Timothy, and Eleanor reached its manor, the elegant house had once again taken on the aspect of a beleaguered battlefield. The front door stood open, and the butler, anxious, perspiring, his usual dignity compromised, hovered in the hall like a ship's captain during a storm. "Mrs. Fortescue is in her room, ma'am," he informed Miss Marple and Dr. Haydock with shaken formality. She collapsed in the drawing-room. "I sent for you at once, Doctor. Inspector Slack is already here." They found Sylvia Fortescue lying propped against embroidered pillows on her bed, her complexion waxen but not yet bearing the unmistakable hue of cyanide victims. Inspector Slack stood at the window with the air of a man whose simple case had begun to grow irritatingly complicated. "Fainted dead away, she did," he announced. Right after taking her tea. The maid says she cried out that it tasted strange and then clutched her from throat. Given the circumstances, I had to assume the worst. Haydock moved briskly to the bedside, his professional manner reasserting itself. He tested Sylvia's pulse, examined her pupils, and sniffed delicately at her breath. Not cyanide, he pronounced after a moment. Nor anything immediately lethal, I think. More likely a strong sedative or perhaps an emetic. Her pulse is fast but not failing. She'll live, though she'd had an age at home. Sylvia's eyes fluttered open at his words, and she focused on Miss Marple with the dazed recognition of someone emerging from a nightmare to discover the nightmare still firmly in place. I thought, she began faintly, it was happening to me this time. The same bitter taste, the same horror. I saw Reggie fall again. Steady now, Haydock soothed. Whatever you took, it was not the same poison. You are, for the moment, quite safe. Inspector Slack produced a small glass from the bedside table, its contents a faintly cloudy remnant of tea. I found this next to her when she collapsed. The maid swears she poured from the same pot she and the other housemaids drank from in the kitchen. No one else felt ill. Miss Marple accepted the glass carefully, sniffed, and then delicately dipped the tip of her knitting needle into the residue. She touched it to her tongue with the reckless courage of advancing years, then nodded slowly. Not cyanide indeed. More like laudanum, or some other strong tincture. Quite enough to produce dizziness and terror, but unlikely to prove fatal in so small a dose. Then what in blazes is the point? Slack demanded. If someone wanted the woman dead, why not use the same method as before? We've already got one cyanide victim. Perhaps, Miss Marple suggested mildly, because the objective was not to kill Mrs. Fortescue, but to frighten her, to convince her that she is next. Fear can be a most persuasive tool, Inspector. People under sufficient terror often reveal things they might otherwise keep hidden. As if to confirm her words, Sylvia's composure crumbled at last. She turned her face away from the room, her shoulders shaking. I can't bear it, she whispered. It wasn't supposed to. Only wanted. Miss Marple moved to the bedside with surprising agility, seating herself on a nearby chair and taking the younger woman's hand in a firm, surprisingly steady grip. My dear Miss Fortescue, you are among friends here. No one is going to drag you off to prison this minute. But you must realise that someone in this house, perhaps several someones, has been playing a very dangerous game indeed. And unless we understand precisely who has done what, more people may be placed at risk. Sylvia's dark eyes searched Miss Marple's face as though gauging the safety of confession. You think I'm involved? I think, Miss Marple replied gently, that you are far less shocked by your husband's death than you believe you ought to be, and I think you know more about the various attempts upon his life than you have yet admitted. Whether you are an active participant or a horrified bystander remains to be seen. Hard Inspector Slack made an impatient sound. If you've something to confess, Mrs. Fortescue, now is the time. Sylvia flinched at his tone, but continued to look only at Miss Marple. I didn't poison Reggie, she said hoarsely. I swear to you I did not, but I did know someone meant him harm long before yesterday. Miss Marple's pale eyes held steady. More than one someone, I suspect. Sylvia drew a shuddering breath. Yes, she whispered. That's what terrified me. It wasn't just one person, it was almost everyone. Even Inspector Slack fell silent at that, the implication settling heavily in the overheated room. Miss Marple, however, merely resumed her gentle grip on Sylvia's hand, her mind already shaping the contours of a truth that was beginning to look less like a single line and more like a tangled knot of intersecting motives, each thread tightening around the dead man's memory. The search of the Colonel's study proved less fruitful than Inspector Slack had anticipated, and more illuminating than he realised. Files bearing familiar village names lay neatly stacked in the desk drawers. Radford, Grant, Vance, even Haydock, each containing a careful accumulation of debts, indiscretions, and quiet little compromises. Blackmail material, the lot of it, Slack declared with satisfaction, rifling through Radford's file. Our builder's been gambling his way toward ruin for years. The Colonel practically owned him. Miss Marple, seated quietly warmed up quietly in one of the leather armchairs, seemed to study her knitting more than the files. Yet she noted with interest that several drawers bore faint rectangles of dust, or where folders had clearly once been, and were now missing. Curious, she remarked gently. "Several files have recently been removed. I wonder by whom and why." Sylvia Fortescue, still pale but recovering under Dr. T. Haydock's supervision, had insisted on being present in the study, claiming she could not bear to lie idle while her own life was under threat. "Reggie locked that desk religiously," she said weakly from the chaise longue by the window. "Only he and I had keys. The morning of the fete, he was and pigs. He's in here for nearly an hour." Sorting through his paws. When I asked what he was doing, he said, "Tidying up loose ends, my dear. I didn't think anything of it at the time." Inspector Slack snorted. "Loose ends, indeed. If half the village knew he held things over them, we've motive enough for an entire convention of murderers." Miss Marple's pale eyes flickered. The phrase seemed to align perfectly with the pattern emerging in her mind. "Sylvia, my dear, do you recall if he mentioned anyone in particular that morning? Any special concern?" Sylvia closed her eyes, thinking back. He did say something peculiar. He was going through Lionel's file and muttered, "At least one branch of the family can be relied on to be usefully disreputable." Then he laughed in that horrid way of his and added, "But others have further to fall, and I assumed he meant Radford or perhaps the vicar, though I've no idea why." It was Eleanor who applied the missing thought. She stood near the bookcase, her hands clasped tightly. "Further to fall," she repeated. "Someone with a spotless reputation. Someone whose ruin would cause real shock." Her gaze, unwilling yet compelled, drifted toward Dr. Haydock. For a moment the room seemed to still. The doctor's brows rose. "I assure you, my dear young lady," Miss Marple interposed, her tone as mild as ever, "the Colonel had a file on you as well, did he not, Doctor?" "On most of us, it seems," Haydock replied evenly. "In my case, a matter of prescriptions written under pressure, for people who would have been better served without them. Sleeping draughts, nerve tonics, nothing illegal, but professionally indelicate, shall we say." Fortescue enjoyed suggesting he might show them to the medical council. Inspector Slack pounced. "And you, of course, have access to digitalis cyanide solutions for certain lab tests." "Inspector," Haydock cut in, his voice tight but controlled, "if you intend to imply that my professional access makes me an obvious murderer, you must also include half these chemists and a good number of photographers in the county." Miss Marple observed him carefully. His indignation was real enough, but beneath it there was something else. Weariness, perhaps, and a trace of something like fear. Not, she thought, the fear of discovery, but of being irrevocably entangled in something he had not entirely controlled. As evening dropped gently over Saint-Tana or Mercabmy, the household at Greenways remained under a strained kind of siege. Sylvia had been ordered to bed, Eleanor and Timothy were sent home under protest, and Radford had been summoned to the manor for further questioning. Lionel still languished resentfully at the station. Miss Marple, walking back to her cottage beneath the soft glow of the street lamps, arranged the facts in her mind with the same patience she applied to sorting tangled skeins. Wool, 4 attempts at murder, brake cables, church masonry, substituted medicine with poise and punch, a 5th unsuccessful fibrouse against Sylvia. Multiple people with different skills and motives. Evidence that appeared a trifle too convenient. A bottle in a potting shed, a monogrammed handkerchief obligingly wrapped around it. A veiled woman buying cyanide weeks earlier. Files removed from the Colonel's desk just before his death. She had seen something very like this once before, long ago. In a smaller and sadder way. A household where several servants, each separately persecuted by a cruel mistress, independently plotted her downfall, only to be forestalled by an unexpected accident. The confusion that followed, as each feared the other's knowledge, had nearly torn them all apart. By the time Miss Marple reached her ivy-covered cottage, her mind had settled on a quiet, inexorable conclusion. The situation at Greenways could not be resolved by further rummaging through papers or chasing after bottles. The truth lay, as it so often did, in the delicate arrangement of human fears and vanities. It was time, she decided, for a little experiment of her own, one that would require a gathering, a pot of tea, and the careful selection of a single, very particular listener. The following afternoon, under a sky washed clean by a night's soft rain, Miss Marple requested that Inspector Slack allow her a little experiment. To his credit, or perhaps because 2 cyanide attempts in as many days had shaken even his certainty, he agreed, though with visible reluctance. Thus it was that the principal figures found themselves assembled once more in Colonel Fortescue's study. Sylvia on the sofa near the window, pale but composed. Lionel Newler, released yet still under suspicion. Gerald Radford, guarded and resentful. Eleanor and Timothy, tense and silent. Dr. Haydock and Inspector Slack standing near the desk, and Miss Marple in her accustomed place by the hearth, knitting resting in her lap. "I have been thinking," Miss Marple began mildly, "that Colonel Fortescue was not, in fact, murdered at the garden fete." Inspector Slack choked. "Not murdered, with cyanide in his glass and an empty poison bottle in the shed?" "Oh, he was poisoned, of course," Miss Marple agreed serenely. "But his death, you see, was already carefully arranged beforehand. The cyanide up in Timbuktu, I believe, was simply my father attempted a murder, the one that finally succeeded, but not in quite the way its author had intended." Her pale eyes moved gently from face to face. "We know now that 3 separate schemes were in motion, Mr. Durr." Radford tampered with the motor brakes, an impulsive, mechanical solution by a desperate man with ruined finances. Lionel, terrified of disinheritance and to take of his uncle's control of the family estate, loosened the stonework on the church roof, miscalculating only the timing of the Colonel's habitual route. Both efforts failed. Radford's mouth tightened. Lionel stared fixedly at the carpet. Neither denied it. But the most ingenious plan, Miss Marple continued softly, was the quietest. Someone with chemical knowledge obtained digitalis, had it dispensed properly, then replaced the active tablets with sugar pills. Without medication, the Colonel's heart would have failed within weeks, leaving behind the appearance of natural causes, a very patient form of murder. Her knitting needles clicked once delicately. That required not only chemical understanding, but intimate access to his medicine, his bedroom and his habits, and the ability to visit the chemist without attracting suspicion. A well-dressed woman, in a veil perhaps. Sylvia's fingers tightened on the arm of the sofa. Miss Marple turned to her with a gentle courtesy. "Your late fiancé was a chemist, was he not, Mrs. Fortescue? You would have learned a good deal, casually, over conversations, over letters, enough to know both how digitalis worked and how cyanide might be prepared in solution." Sylvia gave a short, brittle laugh. "You flatter me, Miss Marple. I'm merely a housewife." "Oh, but I don't think so," Miss Marple said kindly. "I think you are a very intelligent woman who found herself trapped in a marriage obtained by blackmail. You knew that if the Colonel died naturally, you would inherit comfortably and quietly, so you began with the tablets. That was your first attempt." Sylvia's composure wavered, a flush crept into her cheeks. Then, Miss Marple went on, "You realised others were trying too. You noticed the loose stonework at the church. You told the Garden Society you thought the gargoyles quite unsafe, if you recall, and you saw Radford lurking with his tools near the motor. Your slow, safe plan was threatened. Any one of these coarse men might succeed first, leaving you widowed under a cloud of scandal and quite possibly impoverished, should the Colonel change his will in a spiteful last act." Miss Marple's voice softened. "So you grew bolder, you prepared cyanide solution and brought it to the fete. The little spill by the tablecloth, that was your hand trembling, not from lack of courage, but from the unfamiliarity of public crime. You took a glass from the blue-rimmed set, your set, and in the crowd you added the poison, then carried it to your husband with a wife's customary attention. You meant it to look like one more accident, tragic but unconnected to you." Sylvia's eyes flashed. "Then why would I try to poison myself?" "You did not," Miss Marple replied gently. "You prepared the blue tea service in the kitchen yesterday, lacing only your own cup, knowing you would take just one careful sip and spit it out. A very small quantity of cyanide will produce alarming symptoms without certainty of death. You counted on Dr. Haydock's speed and skill. By making yourself an apparent victim, you forced the investigation away from you and toward Lionel, whose handkerchief, long mislaid, you were kind enough to wrap around the cyanide bottle before leaving it in the shed." Sylvia's lips parted in protest, but Miss Marple's next word stopped her. "My little test," she said quietly, "was this. I spoke just now of the Digitalis murder as your first attempt, and you did not deny it. You objected only when I described the poisoning at the fete. You see, Mrs. Fortescue, people are very revealing about the order of their sins." The room held its breath. Sylvia stared at Miss Marple, then at the array of faces, to her fearful, accusing, fascinated. Something in her collapsed. "Yes," she whispered. "Very well. You're quite right, Miss Marple. All of it. I was so tired of being afraid." Inspector Slack stepped forward with his usual formula. but his voice was oddly subdued. As he led Sylvia away, Lionel sank into a chair. Radford stared bleakly at the floor, and Eleanor clung to Timothy's hand as though anchoring herself to a kinder future. Later, walking home along the quiet lane, Miss Marple reflected, not without sadness, that Colonel Fortescue's true murderer had been of his own making. A man who cultivated fearsome independence should not be astonished when those around him eventually learned the darker uses of chemistry, architecture, machinery, and desperation. The village of Crawler resumed its routines in due course. The dahlias were replanted, the fete committee discussed next year's arrangements, and at the post office the story of the four attempts grew slightly more embroidered with each telling. Miss Marple returned to her knitting by the window, her needles clicking steadily as she contemplated once more that very old truth, that murder in the end is merely an extreme, expression of very ordinary human emotions: greed, fear, resentment, and the longing to be free. In the weeks that followed, Mary Mead settled with outward eagerness into its accustomed rhythms, as though repetition of familiar routines might smooth the memory of cyanide and blackmail from the village's collective mind. The postmistress resumed her brisk sorting of letters. The vicar preached sermons on forgiveness with rather more fervour than usual, and Mrs. Price Ridley found herself quite exhausted from the effort of hinting delicately that she had suspected Timothy Grant from the very start. Beneath the surface, however, currents still moved uneasily. The trial at Assizes loomed ahead, and though it was understood that Timothy, under his former name of Edward Marsh, would almost certainly be convicted for Colonel Fortescue's murder and the attempted poisoning of Sylvia, no one could entirely forget that 3 other villagers had also made their own stealthy bids for the Colonel's life. Inspector Slack had insisted on formal statements from Radford, Lionel and Sylvia, and while the Director of Public Prosecutions ultimately declined to bring charges, citing lack of conclusive evidence, and the fact that no actual physical harm had resulted from their failed attempts, each of them lived with the uncomfortable knowledge that Miss Marple and Dr. Haydock at least saw them with their clear eyes. Sylvia Fortescue, newly widowed for the second time in spirit as well as law, elected to leave Greenways Manor within a fortnight. Word spread that she was selling the estate and retiring quietly to the coast. Before her departure, she called upon Miss Marple, arriving at the vine-covered cottage with a dignity that had grown more genuine since her husband's death. "I've brought you something," Sylvia said, placing a small parcel on the tea table. It contained an exquisitely carved ivory knitting needle case, clearly antique. "It belonged to my grandmother. She would have liked you, I think. She had a way of seeing through people as well." Miss Marple accepted the gift with genuine warmth. "You're very kind, Mrs. Fortescue. I hope you will be able to make a new life unburdened by your late husband's papers." Sylvia's mouth curved in a tired approximation of a smile. "Your inspector has removed the most damning documents, and I've destroyed the rest myself. Reggie's little kingdom of fear is over. I only wish it had ended without turning half the village into would-be murderers." When she had gone, Miss Marple sat for some time in her favourite chair, gently stroking the smooth ivory. She thought of Sylvia standing in the study while Timothy was led away, the realization dawning that the man who had courted her ward had been prepared to kill her as well. There were wounds, Miss Marple knew, that no court verdict could properly address. Lionel Fortescue left shortly thereafter for what he described as a much-needed change of scenery on the continent. In the post office, Mrs. Bantry remarked to Miss Marple that foreign cities were notoriously good at swallowing disreputable nephews. Gerald Radford, chastened by his brush with exposure, accepted a much-reduced version of his development scheme under strict oversight from the planning committee. He spoke less loudly in public after that, and seemed to age 10 years in as many weeks. Miss Marple watched him one morning from her garden gate, and reflected not unkindly that some punishments were more enduring when they came from within. Eleanor Vance remained at Greenways temporarily, her inheritance now fully under her own control. She broke off her engagement to Timothy without public explanation, though none was needed. When Miss Marple encountered her in the lane one cool autumn morning, the girl's face bore a new, sober strength. "I suppose I was in love with an idea rather than a man," Eleanor admitted quietly as they walked. "Freedom, defiance, romance, all very exciting. I didn't see what he truly was." "Young ladies rarely do," Miss Marple replied, not unkindly. "We all begin by mistaking intensity for character. It is only later we learn that true goodness tends to be much quieter." "Will you testify at the trial?" Eleanor asked after a moment. "If required," Miss Marple said, "though I fancy Timothy's own actions will speak more eloquently than anything I might say." By the time the first frost silvered the hedgerows, conversation in St. Mary Mead had turned to other matters: harvest festivals, the vicar's new sermon Turan series, and whether Mrs. Bantry's roses would survive the winter. Yet beneath the polite exchanges, people regarded one another with just a trace more caution, a subtle acknowledgement that, given the right pressures, their seemingly placid neighbours might reveal startling depths of desperation. One evening, as she sat by the fire with her knitting, Dr. Haydock called in on his way home. After the usual pleasantries and a cup of tea, he regarded Miss Marple with his shrewd, kindly eyes. "You know," he remarked, "Slack will never admit it, but we were right from the beginning. It wasn't the physical clues that solved this case, it was your infernal understanding of people." Miss Marple smiled faintly. So people are really very much alike, Doctor. One sees the same patterns over and over again, whether in laboratory assistants, tyrannical colonels, or anxious young lovers. It is only the trimmings that vary." "And the 3 who tried and failed?" he asked gravely. "Do you feel no responsibility about letting them go free?" "I think," she said slowly, "that every one of them has been sentenced to live the rest of their lives knowing precisely what they were willing to become. That is no small punishment. As for Timothy, well, his path was set long before he came to St. Mary Mead. The colonel merely hastened what might otherwise have taken a different form." The clock on the mantel chimed the hour, and outside the village lay peaceful under a clear starlit sky. Another murder solved, another knot of human folly gently untangled. Miss Marple reached for her knitting once more, the rhythmic click of her needles as steady and reassuring as ever, while in her mind she filed away this latest example of the lengths to which ordinary people would go when cornered by fear, pride, or this desperate need to escape. In the weeks that followed, St. Mary Mead began, in its own stubbornly English fashion, to fold the extraordinary events at Greenways Manor into the gentle rhythm of village life. Human beings, Miss Marple often reflected, possess a remarkable capacity for resuming their routines, no matter how dramatically those routines have been interrupted. The trial at assizes provided that the inevitable public climax. Timothy Grant, revealed in court under his former name, Thomas Granger, was convicted of Colonel Fortescue's murder and the attempted poisoning of Sylvia Fortescue. The evidence, painstakingly assembled, left little room for doubt. The chemist's receipt from Much Benham bearing his disguised signature, the cyanide solution traced to his former professional connections, Eleanor's account of his movements during the fete, and Dr. Haydock's expert testimony regarding the poison's preparation and effects. The defence counsel made a spirited attempt to portray him as a desperate man, persecuted by the Colonel Fortescue's blackmail, but the prosecution effectively dismantled this narrative by establishing his long-standing pattern of deception, beginning with the laboratory accident that killed David Ashford. The jury, composed largely of practical men accustomed to weighing character as much as circumstance, took little time to reach their unanimous verdict. Back in St. Mary Mead, the aftermath proved quieter, subtler, and in some ways more consequential than the trial itself. Greenways Manor underwent a transformation that surprised many. Sylvia Fortescue, freed at last from her husband's oppressive shadow and spared a second brush with death, made good on her intention to address the damage his blackmail had wrought. With the help of the family solicitor, she reviewed each surviving file and discreetly approached those who had suffered most from the colonel's manipulation. As Miss Marple had predicted, several villagers preferred to let sleeping scandals lie, refusing both restitution and discussion, but others, Mr. Radford among them, accepted practical assistance in rebuilding their lives. The Builders Development Project, revised to satisfy the Planning Committee's concerns, was approved at last, though he moved through the village with a new humility born of having confronted the darkest corners of his own nature. Lionel Fortescue left St. Mary Mead quietly, his departure marked only by a brief notice in the local paper mentioning business opportunities abroad. Miss Marple suspected that the true impetus behind his relocation lay less in commerce than in the uncomfortable knowledge that he had once loosened a gargoyle with murderous intent. One does not easily continue to take tea with neighbours who know such things. Eleanor Vance remained at Greenways for a time, recovering from the double blow of her guardian's tyranny and her suitor's treachery. Sylvia, with a gentleness that might once have surprised those who only knew her as Colonel Fortescue's elegantly controlled wife, gradually extended to the girl the kindness she had herself been denied for so many years. In due course, Eleanor came into her inheritance under revised arrangements that freed her from the need to marry for security. Development Miss Marple approved with quiet satisfaction. Whether Eleanor would eventually choose a partner or a profession or both remained an open question, but for the first time in her life, the choice would be her own. Mary Mead, as was its habit, discussed all of this at length over tea and seed cake. Mrs. Price Ridley opined that such goings-on were inevitable when people forgot their place, while Miss Wetherby confided to anyone who would listen that she had always suspected something about Timothy Grant, though precisely what had never been entirely clear. Through it all, Miss Marple resumed her quiet life at her ivy-covered cottage, tending her garden, chatting with her maid and knitting garments whose final intended recipients remained, as always, somewhat fluid. Only Dr. Haydock perhaps fully appreciated the extent to which her apparently casual observations had guided the investigation at every critical juncture. One afternoon, as they shared tea in her lace-curtains American sitting room, he ventured to say as much. If it hadn't been for you noticing that unfortunate ant by the refreshment table, Miss Marple, we might still be herring after the wrong culprit. Miss Marple smiled, her pale blue eyes holding their usual mild vagueness. One learns a great deal from small creatures, Doctor. Ants, bees, even certain parishioners. People behave in patterns, just as plants do. Given sufficient observation, one can usually tell which are merely invasive and which are truly poisonous. She returned to her knitting, adding softly, in the end, it was not the most violent man who succeeded in murder, but the most frightened. Colonel Fortescue sowed fear wherever he went, and it was fear that finally killed him. There was a kind of symmetry in that, though not, I think, one he would have admired. Outside, the village continued in its familiar way. The vicar's bicycle leaned against the lich gate, children chased hoops along the lane, and Ms. Bantry's latest flower beds made a brave, if somewhat chaotic show in the afternoon sun. Life, Miss Marple knew, would go on. There would be other fates, other scandals, other human dramas played out in parlours, gardens. For now, however, St. Mary Mead had returned to its customary tranquillity, peaceful on the surface, complex beneath, and to those with eyes to see, as endlessly intricate and revealing as the most carefully worked pattern of knitting in Miss Marple's capable, unassuming hands.